world champion Magnus Carlsen and the teenage prodigy Alireza Firouzja continued their rivalry in round 2 of the Magnus Invitational, this online chess tournament featuring 8 of the strongest players in the world, taking place on Chess24. So these matches consist of 4 games, rapid games, so that's 15 minutes on the clock plus 10 seconds increment. So this is rather different from, for example, the Banter Blitz that these two were playing a few days ago. In that, well, it was incredibly close, but you noticed a kind of trend that Magnus was trying to keep games in quite calm, strategic paths, whereas Firouzja was trying to stir up trouble and, suddenly would hit Magnus with a tactic that the world champion had overlooked. And something similar happened in this game, or in the match overall, I should say. So this is the first game. We have Magnus with white fixing the pawn structure and basically trying to keep things calm and playing in quite a strategic way. But watch what Alireza does here. So first of all, knight there. Now that's to cover the e5 square, and we'll see why that's important in a second. It's because he wants to play the knight in here. So there's a bit of pressure there. Carlsen breaks the pin and puts a bit of pressure there. And now we can see with this move why Firouzja wanted to cover e5. So that prevents the bishop coming in here. And I mean, this is incredibly aggressive, putting the question to the bishop straight away. I mean, ideally one would want to come here, but actually in this case, that can be taken and then that pawn on d4 taken. So the bishop has to drop back to e3, which looks a bit ugly in order to protect that d pawn. But then again, that pawn on g5 looks pretty ugly as well. So it's already quite an unusual position. Now there's a threat to take here. So knights exchanged. And the bishop came here and the rook came to b1. Well, that's not so bad for white because the rook looks at b7, so black has to do something about the b7 pawn before developing his bishop. Now, at the moment, this pawn on g5 stands out like a sore thumb. It's pretty ugly, and white could well just undermine black's kingside with pawn to h4, bringing that rook into play or creating weaknesses. So that's why Firouzja advanced the f pawn. So now there's this pawn duo that's of course threatened to trap bishop. Therefore g3 is a very logical move and also prepares to bring out the bishop. And now castles. And so that reinstates the threat of f4. Carlsen played queen b3, knocking that bishop back to e7, and then played f4. Now, in playing queen b3 and putting the bishop back on e7, you can see the e file is blocked just for a moment, so it's less easy to target that bishop. So now black needs to think, well, how do you develop? That b pawn is still a problem. Also the d pawn as well, potentially. Therefore, knight a5, and the queen was pushed back here. But that's not a bad square for the queen anyway. And now c6 to support that d pawn. Magnus was moving pretty fast. I think he'd learned his lesson from the Banter Blitz games with Firouzja, because he was obviously determined not to get into time pressure, or not serious time pressure. So it was moving pretty quickly. If anyone was down on time in these games, it was actually the Iranian. So bishop d6 looks very natural to put some pressure here and freeze the queen to some extent. And Carlsen played c4. Okay, that's nice to break down this pawn. An exchange of pawns on f4 and bishop e6 to hold that center pawn. Carlsen exchanged and finally managed to castle. So we've got a slightly unusual position. Black has a 2-1 majority on the queen side. Okay, that's not playing such a significant role. Presumably at some moment this knight is going to land on c4. We've got an open g-file, so both kings are going to need to tuck into the corner, and Firouzja played king h8 straight away. And now we can see that, yes, black's knight is going to come in here, knight c4, but white's knight is going to land on e5. And that is a stronger piece than the knight on c4. It's centralized, so it's slightly more central than black's knight. So let's just get that on the board. So king h1, yeah, get the king away from the g file, and now knight e5. So this is really, you could say, almost the start of the middle game, where both sides have managed to achieve their goal of bringing their knight to a nice position. But as I said, I think this knight on e5 is stronger than the knight on c4, because it looks at a sort of better range of squares. And that knight is pretty annoying. It's hard for black if that knight is left. Then again, if you exchange it off, then black is left with this not great bishop on e6. I mean, it's possible to play something like rook g8. Let's just have a quick look at this. And then white's rook might come up to the third rank. And then, yes, this looks quite menacing, but actually simply rook g3, and that cuts out any nonsense. And you never know, this rook might come over. But I think particularly in rapid play, you know, it's not easy to live with that knight on e5. And Firouzja coming right back. So this is back to the actual game position. Firouzja, I think, took a very practical decision here. He just eliminated that knight straight away. But there are problems with playing like this, because it leaves these dark squares a little bit weak. You know, if that bishop were able to run in here at some moment, that could be fatal for black's king. If black wants to play in a kind of slightly safety first way, exchanging off that bishop, then this does give white a clear advantage. You can see that this bishop is simply better than the one on e6. The one on e6 is passive. You know, you can imagine an endgame where, supposing all the major pieces were exchanged off and that king coming out to f4 to pressurize here. I mean, white is definitely better there. But Firouzja kept his knight and played rook g8 straight away, and Carlsen kept his bishop. And I think after this move, then really if white plays precisely, then he should be better. As I said, if that bishop manages to get in on these dark squares, it could be extremely nasty for black's king. So let's see what happens. Rook g6, bishop h3, pressure on the pawn on f5. That was defended with rook f8, rook f3. That makes way for the queen's rook to come across. Queen h4. Firouzja is revving up on the king's side. That's what he's like. He's going to try and generate some sharp position where there are going to be some tactics. Carlsen building up on that weak f-pawn. Queen h5. Defending the f-pawn. And the bishop came back to c1. So now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces trained on that isolated pawn. Well, there's no point in trying to defend that anymore. It's all about whether black can get a counterplay here. So Firouzja is looking for tactics. Rook g8. Carlsen plunged in with bishop f5. Notice, by the way, that that knight, although it looks wonderful, you could say that, I'm not going to say it's dominated by the bishop. Who's doing the dominating? It's not clear. But basically those squares are covered by the bishop. And actually that bishop on c1 has real potential, as well as actually just shutting the knight out of the game. Anyway, back to bishop f5. The critical moment in the game where white takes a pawn, potentially can get those rooks into black's position as well. But rook g2, threatening mate in one move. So this is the critical position where both players are running a little bit short of time, and now you've got to get it right. So how do you defend against that mate? Well, if you play rook h3, which looks very normal, then unfortunately that runs into queen takes bishop, and I'm afraid that is a complete and utter disaster. Of course, rook takes and rook g1, or yeah, indeed, rook takes queen, rook g1 is mate. Not good. Okay, what else have we got? What about h3? Seems okay, but actually after this exchange, after rook takes, queen g6, very nasty. Rook g1 coming very soon, and black is getting through to the king. And if in this position queen takes, well, in fact, this endgame is not at all clear. So what did Carlsen do? Well, he found the best move in the position, undoubtedly. He played bishop h3, which puts some pressure here, but also starts to open up the f-file. And here, for example, if bishop takes, then things turn in white's favour. The queen is attacked. Black can trade it to get tricky with this move. If the queen is taken here, then of course rook g1. But now, cool move. Bishop f4. There's no trick with queen takes bishop because of queen takes h7 mate. And in the meantime, this is happening. So for example, okay, let me make a random move for black. Not a good move, but there's really nothing better. e6, that can't be taken because of the mate on h7. And just bishop g3 locks out black's major pieces from protecting that. Basically, white has a winning position here. So bishop h3 is just being played. What did Firouzja play? He took on e2. That was taken, and then bishop takes h3. So now Carlsen is the exchange up. He played rook g1 after not too much thought, and here Firouzja resigned. Well, he was right to resign. There is no way back for black in this position. This knight's still looking out of play. If these rooks are exchanged and queen g4 check, in fact the king is safe on h1. And now there's a threat to play rook f8, and let's say h5. Well, we can just exchange queens, and well, an extra exchange. That e-pawn is about to roll through after a bishop h6 check. It's yeah, absolutely hopeless. Firouzja was right to resign. So a convincing victory in that first game. I'm going to show you some more from this match. Remember, there were 4 games played in total. So watch out for my next video with game 2, which had some amazing surprises in it.